Hey, this is Miss Hayes, and for today's EdPuzzle, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the genre of memoir. As you know, Elie Wiesel's Night is a memoir, and a memoir is a type of autobiography that is focused on a specific moment or theme or series of events in a person's life. Here, obviously, Elie Wiesel's memoir Night is focusing on his experience through the Holocaust. So first we're going to talk about why we even read memoir. So, as you notice, this has been truncated. This means it's been shortened. This is not the whole thing. You probably didn't read many memoirs in English class in high school. If you're still taking English at Stanford, because this is from the Stanford Daily, it's a college student writing this, you probably haven't read many memoirs here, either. Historically, memoir was considered a lower form of writing, not worthy of being labeled real literature. It was too personal, too self-absorbed for the critics of decades past. Even in the last few decades, memoir has been considered a popular genre rather than a literary genre, often treated with the same amusement as John Grisham novels along literary types. However, over the last 2 decades or so, we've seen a renaissance for the memoir form. Authors like Tobias Wolff, Mary Karr, and Cheryl Strayed have inserted memoir into the front and center of literary conversations, merging humor, self-critical honesty, and epiphany into books that not only keep the pages turning, but change minds, hearts, and perhaps more importantly, perspectives about the worlds we inhabit, past and present. I have a confession to make. Through all the great novels I've read, I've rarely felt myself, my life, and my experience of American culture represented on the page. Partially, this was due to the age of novels I read, but there was more. Fiction had a heroic depth that, quite frankly, did not align with the slightly amusing banality of my daily experience. My misfortunes did not feature battle scenes or brutal miscarriages, but things like losing friends, negotiating petty family grievances, juggling self-criticism and self-compassion, and thinking about what the heck I was going to do with my life. Not exactly the stuff of great literature the last time I checked. But it might just be the stuff of great memoir. First, to clear up a common misconception, memoirs are not autobiographies. Autobiographies cover a person's whole life, hinging on a person's career success. Famous people write autobiographies because others actually care about their formative years, their professional experiences, and their reflections on an entirely life well, or infamously, lived. Memoirs, on the other hand, articulate the lives of normal civilians. They focus on particular themes or periods of a person's life, telling a story through an almost fictitious narrative frame. Facts and historical moments take back seat to lived memories as they've been contoured over years of personal growth and reflection. Memoir is the gritty stuff, the little shards that may not fit together perfectly because life doesn't either. Take a moment here to think about what you did with Never Shall I Forget. Remember that question you saw asking, are we reading from 15-year-old Elie Wiesel here, or are we reading the author Elie Wiesel's reflection here? So that's a moment to stop and reflect. Memoir does not tie up all the loose ends and does not glide along a plot arc like a work of fiction. It is not always profound or brilliant or tragic, but it is real life, or as close to real life as you can possibly get in the form of a paperback book. It is the closest we can get to living another person's real story, and the closest we can get to walking a mile in another's shoes. Memoir is, in my experience, the best way to immerse yourself in a new perspective that really existed or exists in the same world we all inhabit. Particularly in this political and cultural moment, I cannot think of a better medium for helping us understand and empathize with one another other than the memoir. Whether it's Mary Karr's Lit or G. Vance's stunning Hillbilly Elegy, memoir has the power to bring us together and unearth our mutual humanity in a way that newsreels and 800-word articles fail to do. Memoir may not be literature in the canonical sense of the word, but if literature's primary purpose is to help humans understand each other, and I believe that it is, then memoir deserves a front and center place on the literary shelf. So you're going to have a variation of these questions now in your EdPuzzle. You can go through this video in order to see various points in this article to help you answer these questions. And once again, you'll be answering these questions in EdPuzzle. Now that you've answered those questions, let's move forward, and we're going to look at the preface of Elie Wiesel's memoir, Night. Let's see if I can get the light fixed a little bit in here first. Well, that did a little bit for us, huh? So, this is the preface to the new translation. So this means that Elie Wiesel had already had his memoir out for a while. It had obviously done well enough for them to do a second printing, to have a new translation. And so keep that in mind. There has been a readership for Night when Elie Wiesel is writing this preface. Keep in mind, too, those questions you answered about the purpose of memoir as you're looking here. If in my lifetime I was to write only one book, this would be the one. Just as the past lingers in the present, all my writings after Night, including those that deal with the biblical, Talmudic, or Hasidic themes, profoundly bear its stamp and cannot be understood if one has not read this very first of my works. Why did I write it? Did I write it so as to not go mad, or, on the contrary, to go mad, and in order to understand the nature of madness, the immense, terrifying madness that had erupted in history and in the conscience of mankind? Was it to leave behind a legacy of words, of memories, to help prevent history from repeating itself? Or was it simply to preserve a record of the ordeal I endured as an adolescent, at an age when one's knowledge of death and evil should be limited to what one discovers in literature? There are those who tell me that I survived in order to write this text. I am not convinced. I don't know how I survived. I was weak, rather shy. I did nothing to save myself. A miracle? Certainly not. If heaven could or would perform a miracle for me, why not for the others more deserving than myself? It was nothing more than chance. However, having survived, I needed to give some meaning to my survival. Was it to protect that meaning that I set paper to an experience in which nothing made sense? In retrospect, I must confess that I do not know, or no longer know, what I wanted to achieve with my words. I only know that without this testimony, my life as a writer, or my life period, would not have become what it is, that of a witness who believes he has a moral obligation to try to prevent the enemy from enjoying one last victory by allowing his crimes to be erased from human memory. For today, thanks to recently discovered documents, evidence shows that in the early days of their ascension to power, the Nazis in Germany set out to build a society in which there simply would be no room for Jews. Towards the end of their reign, their goal changed. They decided to leave behind a world in ruins in which Jews had never seemed to have existed. This is why everywhere in Russia, in Ukraine, in Lithuania, the Eisengruppen carried out the final solution by turning their machine guns on more than 1 million Jews, men, women, and children, and by throwing them into huge mass graves dug just moments before by the victims themselves. Special units would then disinter the corpses and burn them. Thus, for the first time in history, Jews were not only killed once, but twice, but denied burial in a cemetery. It's obvious that the war which Hitler and his accomplices waged was a war not only against Jewish men, women, and children, but also against Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and therefore Jewish memory. Convinced that this period in history would be judged one day, I knew that I must bear witness. I knew that while I had many things to say, I did not have the words to say them. Painfully aware of my limitations, I watched helplessly as language became an obstacle. It became clear that it would be necessary to invent a new language. But how would one rehabilitate and transform words betrayed and perverted by the enemy? Hunger, thirst, fear, transportation, selection, fire, chimney. All these words have some intrinsic meaning, but in those times they meant something else. So here Elie Wiesel talks about the struggle of language. I encourage you to read this moment in your copy of the book. But for this EdPuzzle, we're going to focus on our conversation pieces. Deep down, the witness knew then, as he does now, that his testimony would not be received. After all, it deals with the event which sprang from the darkest zone of man. Only those who experienced Auschwitz knows what it was. Others will never know. But would they at least understand? Could men and women who consider it normal to assist the weak, to heal the sick, to protect small children, and to respect the wisdom of their elders understand what happened here? Would they be able to comprehend how, within that cursed universe, the masters tortured the weak and massacred the children, the sick, and the old? And yet, having lived through this experience, one could not keep silent, no matter how difficult, if not impossible, it was to speak. Again, this is a moment here that I encourage you to read in your book, but we are going to focus not on language here, but on silence and witness in memoir. In the Yiddish version, the narrative does not end with the image in the mirror, but with a gloomy meditation on the present. And now, scarcely 10 years after Buchenwald, I recognize that the world forgets too quickly. Today, Germany is a sovereign state. The German army has been resuscitated. Ilse Koch, the notorious sadistic monster of Buchenwald, has been allowed to have children and to live happily ever after. War criminals stroll through the streets of Hamburg and Munich. The past seems to have been erased, relegated to oblivion. Today, there are anti-Semites in Germany, France, and even the United States who tell the world that the story of 6 million assassinated Jews is nothing but a hoax, and many people, not knowing any better, may well believe them, if not today, then tomorrow or the day after. I am not so naive as to believe that this slim volume will change the course of history or shake the conscience of a world. Books no longer have the power they once did. Those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow. And so here Elie Wiesel answers the question, why is there a new translation? Why did he republish this book? And he explains that he now has the words to better convey this experience. And so why it was so important for him to have a new translation. Again, I encourage you to read this, but again, I want to emphasize these moments that discuss this idea of memoirs as a means of addressing the silence and bearing witness. Before concluding this introduction, I believe it important to emphasize how strongly I feel that books, just like people, have a destiny. Some invite sorrow, others joy, some both. Earlier, I described the difficulties encountered in Night before its publication in French 47 years ago. Despite overwhelmingly favorable reviews, the book sold poorly. The subject was considered morbid and interested no one. If a rabbi happened to mention the book in his sermon, there were always people ready to complain that it was senseless to burden the children with the tragedies of the Jewish past. Since then, much has changed. Night has been received in ways that I never expected. Today, students in high schools and colleges in the United States and elsewhere read it as part of their curriculum. How to explain this phenomenon? First of all, there's been a powerful change in the public's attitude. In the 50s and 60s, adults born before or during World War II showed a careless and patronizing indifference towards what is so inadequately called the Holocaust. That's no longer true. Back then, few publishers had the courage to publish books on the subject. Today, such works are on most book lists. The same's true in academia. Back then, few schools offered courses on the subject, while today many do. And strangely, those courses are particularly popular. The topic of Auschwitz has become part of mainstream culture. This may be because the public knows that the number of survivors is shrinking daily and is fascinated by the idea of sharing memories that will soon be lost. For in the end, it's all about memory, its sources and its magnitude, and of course, its consequences. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear. His duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Sometimes I am asked if I know the response to Auschwitz. The answer is that not only do I not know it, but that I don't even know if a tragedy of this magnitude has a response. What I do know is that there is a response and responsibility. When we speak of this era of evil and darkness so close and yet so distant, responsibility is the key word. The witness has forced himself to testify. For the youth of today, for the children who will be born tomorrow, he does not want his past to become their future. Signed, Elie Wiesel. As you answer these final questions in your EdPuzzle, I challenge you to be critically reflective here. Thank you for challenging yourself to work with what is a very intense topic at times that are also emotionally exhausting. Thank you for your work here, and if you have questions, email your teacher, whether that be me or Summerlin or Edwards. Thank you again for your excellence and your hard work here.